She told me my concrete bridge was disrupting the lake's energy field, like it was personally attacking her chakras. Then the HOA stepped in, and the next thing I knew, 60 years of family history vanished overnight. No notice, no conversation, just gone. All because it didn't match the vibe of her overpriced retreat. But here's what these HOA types always forget. Some places remember who they belong to, and sometimes the land has a funny way of settling scores. Comment below with your state, because what happened next turned this peaceful little lake into something you'd expect from a courtroom, if the judge were Mother Nature herself. My name is Wade Thatcher, and for 6 peaceful years I lived the simple life beside Pine Lake in Bitter Hollow, Colorado. Every morning at sunrise I'd walk across that old concrete bridge my grandfather built, carrying jars of golden honey from my beehives to sell at the local farmer's market. The bridge wasn't much to look at, weathered concrete spans held together by 60 years of mountain winters, but it was solid, functional, and most importantly, it was ours. My grandfather had built it with his own hands, back in the 1960s, when concrete was built to last forever, and people who thought everything needed to look like a magazine cover. I still remember the first time Grandpa took me across that bridge when I was maybe 7 years old. His calloused hand held mine as we walked those weathered concrete spans, our footsteps echoing across the water below. "Wade," he said, stopping halfway across to point at the mountains reflected in the lake. "This bridge isn't just for walking, it's how we stay connected to what's real." Every section here was poured with concrete that grew on this land. Every joint was formed by hands that understood what it means to build something that lasts. He knelt down and ran his fingers along the smooth concrete surface, showing me how each section had been carefully formed and fitted. "Remember this, boy. A bridge doesn't just connect 2 pieces of land. It connects the people who built it to the people who use it. That's why it matters." Those morning walks to market were my favorite part of each day. I'd load my canvas bag with mason jars of honey, each one catching the early sunlight like liquid amber, and set off across the bridge as mist rose from the lake surface. The concrete spans would be cool and slightly damp with dew, and sometimes I'd stop halfway across just to listen to the gentle lapping of water against the pilings below. I'd walk that bridge like a priest walking his temple, except I was offering honey, not salvation. The lake itself was maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, fed by 3 mountain streams that brought snowmelt down from the peaks above. In summer, the water was crystal clear and cold enough to make you gasp if you were brave enough to swim. In winter, it would freeze solid, and I'd sometimes see deer walking carefully across the ice, their hooves clicking against the frozen surface like nature's own percussion section. My grandfather had chosen this spot for our family homestead because he understood that water was life in the high country, and anyone who controlled access to good water would never want for anything. Life was good until Marla Gentry bought the old fishing lodge across the lake and turned it into something called Stillness Haven. $4 million she paid for that property, and the first thing she did was establish a homeowners association. Now, I'd been living here long before any HOA existed, but apparently that didn't matter to Marla. She had plans, big plans, to transform our quiet little corner of Colorado into what she called a premium wellness destination for discerning individuals seeking authentic tranquility. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. Typed on cream-colored paper with the Stillness Haven logo, it politely requested that I consider removing the unsightly concrete structure that was negatively impacting the aesthetic harmony of our shared lakefront environment. I read it twice, then used it to start my wood stove. I figured that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. 3 days later, Marla showed up at my door with a group of her guests. She was a tall, thin woman in her late 30s, dressed in flowing white clothes that probably cost more than my monthly honey sales. Her guests followed behind her like disciples, all carrying yoga mats and wearing the same serene expression. "Wade," she said, extending a manicured hand, "I'm Marla Gentry, your new neighbor. I was hoping we could discuss our little bridge situation." She gestured toward my grandfather's bridge like it was a dead animal. "You see, when my guests come here for their wellness retreats, they're seeking visual peace. That structure creates a jarring interruption in the natural flow of energy across the water." I looked at her, then at her guests, who were all nodding like bobbleheads. The contrast was almost comical. Here was this woman in clothes that had never seen a day of real work, talking about natural flow to a man whose family had been part of this landscape for 3 generations. "Ma'am," I said, "that bridge has been there since 1963. My grandfather built it so we could get our honey to town. It's not going anywhere. Marla's serene smile never wavered, but I caught something cold flickering in her eyes. I understand your attachment, she said, but surely you can see how it disrupts the tranquil experience we're trying to create. Perhaps we could work out some sort of compensation arrangement? When I shook my head, her smile got tighter. Well, she said, turning to her guests, I suppose some people just can't appreciate the importance of environmental harmony. That's when one of her guests, a woman wearing enough crystals to stock a geology museum, spoke up. Oh my goodness, just looking at that old concrete makes my chakras feel completely unbalanced. It's like visual pollution. The others murmured agreement, and Marla nodded sympathetically. You see, Wade? Your bridge is actually causing physical discomfort to people who are trying to heal. Surely that's not what you want. I wanted to tell her exactly what I thought about her chakras, but I kept my mouth shut and watched them leave. The ultimatum came a week later. Another cream-colored letter, but this one wasn't quite as polite. Dear Mr. Thatcher, it read, the Pine Lake Homeowners Association has received numerous complaints regarding the deteriorating concrete structure on your property. For safety and aesthetic reasons, this structure must be removed within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in the HOA exercising its authority to ensure community standards are maintained. It was signed with Marla's flowing signature and dated exactly 30 days from when I received it. I should have known she wasn't just making empty threats. Marla Gentry wasn't the type of woman who made idle promises. She was the type who got what she wanted, when she wanted it, and she wanted my bridge gone. But what she didn't know was that my grandfather had taught me something important before he died. Water listens to those who know how to talk to it, Wade. And sometimes, when people don't listen to reason, well, water has its own way of making a point. I thought she was just making threats until day 31, when I woke up and looked out to where my bridge used to be. Nothing but water. The bridge my grandfather built with his own hands. The bridge that had weathered 6 decades of Colorado winters. The bridge that connected me to the outside world was gone. Completely gone. Not collapsed, not damaged, but surgically removed like it had never existed at all. The morning was crisp and clear, with that particular Rocky Mountain clarity that makes every detail stand out like it's been etched in crystal. Frost covered the pine needles, and my breath made little clouds in the cold air as I walked to my usual spot by the kitchen window. That's where I always stood each morning, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. It was my daily ritual, my moment of peace before the day began. Except this morning, when I looked toward the lake, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Where 60 years of solid craftsmanship should have been, there was just empty water, smooth as glass, reflecting the morning sky like nothing had ever disturbed its surface. I threw on my clothes and ran down to the water's edge, my boots slipping on the frost-covered grass. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of tiny waves against the shore. All that remained were the concrete footings on either side of the lake, and even those had been cut clean with industrial precision. In the clear mountain water, I could see chunks of concrete scattered on the lake bottom like broken monuments. My grandfather's craftsmanship, each section carefully formed and placed with the love of a man building something for his grandchildren, was now reduced to underwater debris slowly being covered by settling silt. I stood there in my boots and pajamas, staring at 60 years of family history sinking into the mud, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pure, burning rage. This wasn't just destruction of property. This was erasure of memory. The deliberate obliteration of a connection that had tied 3 generations of Thatchers to this land. I could see my grandfather's initials etched into a piece of concrete, the letters J for Jacob Thatcher, still visible through the water, like a grave marker for everything my family had built here. The worst part was imagining how they'd done it. These weren't vandals who'd smashed something in a moment of anger. This was calculated, professional demolition, carried out under cover of darkness by people who knew exactly what they were destroying and didn't care. I could almost hear their laughter as Grandpa's legacy turned into rubble in the moonlight. I called Sheriff Otis Ballard immediately. Otis was a good man, fair but by the book, and he'd known my family since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. "Wade," he said when he arrived, "I'm real sorry about this, but I gotta tell you, it was all legal. Marla had the proper permits." He showed me the paperwork, all stamped and official. Emergency removal of hazardous structure, it said. Immediate safety concern due to structural deterioration. I looked at those papers and knew exactly what had happened. Marla had done her homework. Otis, I said, my voice shaking with anger I was trying to control, that bridge was solid as the day Grandpa built it. You know that, you've walked across it yourself. The sheriff nodded, looking uncomfortable. I know, Wade, but according to this inspector's report, it was ready to collapse any day. Says here the support beams were rotted through. I laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. Support beams? Those were solid concrete, Otis. They don't rot in 60 years. That concrete was harder than steel. But we both knew it didn't matter what I said. The paperwork was legal, the permits were in order, and my bridge was at the bottom of the lake. That's when Marla showed up, right on cue. She came walking down from her resort like she just happened to be in the neighborhood, wearing another one of her flowing white outfits and that same serene smile. Oh my, she said, looking at the empty space where my bridge used to be. What happened here? I wanted to grab her by those flowing sleeves and introduce her to the lake personally, but Sheriff Ballard was standing right there, and I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of watching me lose control. You know exactly what happened, I said, my words coming out low and steady despite the fury burning in my chest. You had my bridge torn down in the middle of the night. She tilted her head with mock concern, like a therapist dealing with a difficult patient. Now Wade, she said, holding up her hands like she was calming a wild animal. The HOA was simply ensuring community safety. That old structure was a lawsuit waiting to happen. But I'm not unreasonable. I'd be happy to discuss purchasing your property at fair market value. Think of all the possibilities. You could start fresh somewhere new, somewhere without all these complications. She gestured at my cabin, my beehives, my entire life, like it was just complications to be tidied up. I was trapped now, literally. Without the bridge, the only way off my little peninsula was by boat. I had an old kayak, but loading it up with honey jars for market trips wasn't exactly practical. A single jar dropped in the water would be a week's worth of work lost to the lake bottom. Marla knew this, of course. She'd calculated every angle, figured out exactly how to make my life impossible without technically breaking any laws. Think about my offer, Wade, she said as she turned to leave, her voice carrying that same patronizing tone she probably used with her meditation students. I'm sure we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. After all, what's the point of clinging to the past when you could embrace a more harmonious future? The sheriff left with her, and I was alone with the water and the empty space where my life used to make sense. That evening, my neighbor Doris Rayner came by in her little fishing boat. Doris was 68 years old and tougher than a $2 steak. She lived on the lake almost as long as my family had, and she was about the only person left who remembered how things used to be. Wade, she said, tying her boat to my dock. I saw what they did. It's a damn shame. We sat on my porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the water, both of us looking at that empty space where the bridge should have been. You know, Doris said after a while, your grandfather once told me about that old dam up in the woods. Said it was built back when they first diverted the creek to fill this lake. I'd almost forgotten about the dam. Grandpa had shown it to me when I was maybe 10 years old, explained how the early settlers had built it to control the water flow. Most folks don't even know it's there, Doris continued, but your grandfather, he understood how these mountain waters work, used to say that anyone who controlled that dam controlled the lake. She looked at me with eyes that had seen 8 decades of Colorado winters. Might be worth taking a look at it if you know what I mean. The next morning, I took my kayak upstream into the dense pine forest where most tourists never ventured. Following the creek backward toward its source, I paddled through narrow channels overhung with branches, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind. It took me 2 hours to find what I was looking for, hidden behind a stand of old-growth pines, like nature's own secret. There it was, a small concrete dam, maybe 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, looking exactly like my grandfather had described it 60 years ago. But this wasn't just any piece of old infrastructure. As I pulled my kayak up onto the rocky shore and approached the structure, I could see the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. This dam had been built by hands that understood both engineering and artistry. The concrete was still solid after all these decades, but it was what had been built into it that took my breath away. Embedded in the face of the dam were brass fittings that gleamed like gold in the morning sunlight, and a series of hand-forged iron wheels and levers that looked like they belonged on an old steam engine. This wasn't just functional infrastructure. This was a piece of mountain machinery built by craftsmen who took pride in their work. The dam was still in perfect working condition, with a manual gate system that looked like it had been maintained regularly. That's when I realized my grandfather hadn't just told me about this dam as a history lesson. He'd been showing me the family insurance policy. The main control wheel was as big as a ship's helm, with spokes worn smooth by decades of hands turning it through countless adjustments. Brass plates bolted to the concrete bore instructions etched in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Main flow, turn clockwise to increase. Bypass channel, counterclockwise opens eastern route. Emergency release, pull red lever only in extreme conditions. I spent the morning examining the mechanism, understanding how it worked, and gradually realizing the genius of what my grandfather had built. The dam controlled the flow from 3 mountain streams that fed into Pine Lake. By adjusting these gates, you could direct water toward the lake, away from it, or into entirely different channels that ran through the valley. But it was more than just water management. Looking at the brass fittings and the careful engineering, I understood that this was my grandfather's way of staying connected to the mountain itself. He hadn't just diverted water. He'd learned to speak the mountain's language. As I traced the various channels with my eyes, following where each stream would flow depending on the gate positions, I began to see the landscape the way my grandfather must have seen it. Water wasn't just H2O flowing downhill. It was the mountain's bloodstream, the life force that connected every living thing in these valleys. The pine trees depended on it, the wildlife followed it, and anyone who understood how to direct it held a kind of power that no HOA permit could touch. Water doesn't fight, Wade, I could almost hear his voice saying. It just finds another way, and when it finds that way, nothing in the world can stop it. I ran my hands over the control mechanisms, feeling the weight of the iron levers and the smooth operation of the brass valves. Each component had been crafted to last, built with the understanding that whoever came after would need to be able to operate this system decades into the future. There was even a leather-bound logbook sealed in a waterproof case, filled with my grandfather's notes about seasonal adjustments, flood management, and what he called the mountain's moods. Reading those pages was like receiving a master class in hydrology from beyond the grave. For the first time since my bridge disappeared, I smiled. I started making small adjustments, just tiny ones, redirecting maybe 10% of the flow into an alternate channel that curved around through the forest. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would cause immediate problems, just a gentle suggestion to the water that it might want to consider taking a different path. The beauty of it was that everything I was doing was completely legal. This dam was on my family's land, and the water rights had been grandfathered in since the 1940s. As I worked with the controls, I began to understand why my grandfather had built this system the way he had. Each valve, each channel, each adjustment point had been positioned not just for maximum efficiency, but for maximum flexibility. This wasn't just about moving water from point A to point B. This was about having options, about being able to respond to whatever challenges the future might bring. My grandfather had understood something that people like Marla Gentry never would. Real power doesn't come from permits and lawyers and HOA bylaws. Real power comes from understanding the forces of nature and working with them instead of against them. I made careful notes of my adjustments, following my grandfather's example of documenting every change. Day 1, I wrote in the margin of his logbook, redirected 10% of eastern flow through bypass channel, testing system response and downstream effects. Purpose: education of certain parties regarding the true nature of mountain water systems. I figured Grandpa would have appreciated both the precision and the diplomacy of that entry. Within 2 days, the changes became noticeable. The lake level dropped maybe 6 inches, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to strand Marla's fancy wooden dock high and dry. Her guests had to wade through mud to reach their meditation boats. I watched through my binoculars as confused wellness seekers stood ankle-deep in lake muck, their white yoga pants stained brown, trying to figure out why their tranquil water experience had become a swamp walk. Marla was on her phone constantly, probably calling everyone from the Weather Service to the Army Corps of Engineers, trying to find out why the lake was shrinking. But I wasn't done, not even close. Over the next week, I made more adjustments, learning the dam's personality like a musician learning a new instrument. I discovered that by redirecting water from the eastern inlet, I could create fascinating currents that made sections of the lake unsuitable for those floating meditation sessions Marla advertised. Her guests would start their aquatic mindfulness journey only to find themselves spinning in slow circles or pushed up against the shore by invisible underwater forces. Watching through my binoculars, I could see the confusion and frustration building as Marla's perfect wellness environment became increasingly unpredictable. The real breakthrough came when I found the master control, a wheel that looked like it belonged on an old ship. When I turned it, I could redirect the entire primary flow away from Pine Lake and into what my grandfather's notes called the Old Channel. According to his hand-drawn maps, this channel ran directly through the valley where Still Nest Haven now sat. In the early days, before the dam was built, that's where the mountain water naturally flowed. The lake was actually the artificial creation, not the stream. Standing next to that old concrete structure, with the sound of rushing water filling the forest around me and my grandfather's wisdom flowing through my hands like the mountain streams themselves, I made my decision. Marla wanted to play hardball. She wanted to use lawyers and permits and bureaucratic tricks to destroy my family's legacy. Fine. But she'd picked a fight with someone who understood that in these mountains, water always wins. And I was about to give her a masterclass in hydrodynamics that she'd never forget. Marla's transformational wellness weekend was scheduled to be the crown jewel of her summer season. 50 premium guests paying $3,000 each for 3 days of what her brochure called authentic mountain serenity and guided spiritual awakening. She'd been advertising it for months, promising exclusive access to pristine lake experiences and private meditation sessions on the water. The guest list read like a who's who of Colorado's wealthy wellness enthusiasts, the kind of people who paid more for a weekend retreat than most folks made in a month. I watched from my cabin as the expensive cars started arriving on Friday afternoon. Tesla after Tesla pulled up to the resort, followed by BMW SUVs and the occasional Porsche Cayenne. These were Marla's people, urban professionals, seeking their monthly dose of nature before returning to their climate-controlled lives. They came dressed in designer hiking gear that had never seen a real trail, carrying yoga mats that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, perfect targets for what I had planned. Saturday morning, I began Phase 1. Using the dam controls, I started redirecting water away from the lake in carefully measured increments. Nothing sudden, nothing that would cause immediate panic, just a gradual lowering that would slowly reveal the problems with Marla's waterfront paradise. By noon, the resort's boat dock was sitting on mud flats instead of floating on water. The elegant wooden walkways that guests used to access their meditation boats were now bridges to nowhere, ending 3 feet above the lake's surface. I positioned myself with binoculars on my roof, watching the confusion unfold like a live entertainment show. Guests gathered on the resort's deck, pointing at the receding waterline and asking their wellness guides why the lake seemed to be evaporating. Marla appeared around 1 o'clock, striding across the resort grounds in full damage control mode, her serene mask starting to show cracks. She gestured wildly at the stranded dock while talking rapidly into her phone, probably trying to find someone to blame for this natural phenomenon. The afternoon meditation session was supposed to take place on floating platforms anchored 50 feet from shore. Instead, guests found themselves sitting cross-legged on what looked like wooden life rafts beached on a muddy slope. One woman in a $500 yoga outfit tried to maintain her Zen pose while her meditation cushion slowly sank into the lake bottom. Another guest, a man who'd clearly spent serious money on his spiritual retreat wardrobe, gave up entirely when his white linen pants became brown linen pants, courtesy of the exposed lake mud. By evening, the resort's swimming pool had become the only viable water feature, but even that was affected. The pool's refill system drew from the lake, and with the water level dropping, the pumps started pulling in mud and debris. What had been crystal clear mountain water in the morning was now a cloudy brown soup that looked more like chocolate milk than the purified alpine experience promised in the brochure. Guests stood around the pool deck holding cocktails and staring at water that wouldn't have been suitable for washing their cars, let alone swimming. The real chaos began when the resort's kitchen discovered their water pressure had dropped to a trickle. Apparently, the entire facility relied on lake water for everything from cooking to shower systems. $3,000 guests found themselves unable to shower after their muddy meditation mishaps, and the restaurant had to start serving meals on paper plates because they couldn't properly wash dishes. I could hear raised voices carrying across the water as premium wellness seekers demanded explanations for why their authentic mountain experience was starting to feel more like a camping disaster. Marla spent Saturday night making emergency phone calls, trying to arrange for water trucks and portable facilities. I watched lights burning in the resort's main building until well past midnight, probably crisis management meetings with her staff. She had to know this wasn't just bad luck or unusual weather. The timing was too perfect, the problems too comprehensive, but proving I was responsible would require admitting that someone else controlled the water system she'd assumed was just part of the natural landscape? Sunday morning brought the weekend's crowning disaster. Several guests tried to check out early but discovered their expensive cars were now parked on what had become an island. The resort's access road, which crossed a low-lying area near the lake outlet, was underwater from the redirected flow I'd been gradually increasing. 50 wealthy wellness seekers found themselves essentially stranded, dependent on the same woman who'd promised them tranquility, but had delivered what one guest loudly described as the most stressful weekend of my entire life. That's when I knew Phase 2 was ready to begin. Because what Marla didn't realize yet was that I hadn't been draining the lake just to inconvenience her guests. I'd been clearing the way for something much more dramatic. All that water I'd been redirecting, it was building up behind a natural ridge, waiting for me to release it all at once through the old mountain channel that ran directly under Stillness Haven's main buildings. Sunday evening, I made my final adjustments to the dam controls. Everything I'd done up to this point had been preparation, like clearing the stage before the main performance. Now it was time to return the water to its original path, the route it had followed for centuries before humans decided to play with mountain hydrology. I turned the master wheel all the way, opening gates that hadn't been fully opened since my grandfather first installed them decades ago. The sound was immediate and unmistakable, the deep rumble of thousands of gallons per minute changing course. The old channel that ran under Stillness Haven wasn't just a theoretical waterway drawn on my grandfather's maps. It was a genuine geological feature, a natural depression that had been carved by centuries of snowmelt and spring runoff. When the original settlers built the dam, they'd simply redirected the water into an artificial lake, but the underlying terrain remained unchanged. Now, as I restored the original flow, that ancient riverbed was about to reclaim its birthright. Within 2 hours, water began seeping up through the resort's basement floors. Marla's guests, who were already dealing with the chaos of blocked roads and failed facilities, suddenly found themselves facing something entirely new. The building was flooding from underneath. Not dramatically, not like a broken pipe or burst dam disaster, but slowly and inevitably, like the mountain itself was taking back what belonged to it. The resort's lower level, which housed the spa facilities and meditation rooms, became a series of shallow ponds as groundwater rose through the foundation. I watched through my binoculars as maintenance staff ran around with mops and buckets, trying to fight an enemy they couldn't see or understand. Emergency pumps appeared, but they were battling more than just standing water. They were fighting geology itself, trying to hold back a mountain stream that had been flowing through that valley since before humans arrived in Colorado. The harder they pumped, the faster new water seeped in, like trying to empty the ocean one bucket at a time. By midnight, the first floor was compromised. Water was rising through the expensive hardwood floors, warping the carefully chosen materials that Marla had selected to create her perfect wellness environment. The meditation hall, with its hand-picked crystals and imported Tibetan singing bowls, became a wading pool. Guests evacuated to the upper floors, their $3,000 weekend having transformed into something closer to a disaster movie experience. Marla appeared at my door around 2 in the morning, but not with her usual serene confidence. She was soaking wet, probably from trying to help with the emergency pumping efforts, and her designer wellness outfit was replaced by practical boots and a raincoat. But the biggest change was in her eyes. The cold calculation I'd seen before was gone, replaced by something close to panic. "Wade," she said, "we need to talk right now." "Talk about what?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what she meant. "Your water problems aren't my concern, Marla, just like my bridge wasn't yours." She stepped closer, dropping the pretense of politeness. "Don't play games with me. I know you're doing this somehow. That dam up in the forest? That's you, isn't it?" I looked at her with the same innocent expression she'd given me when my bridge disappeared. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a beekeeper who's been trapped on his property since someone destroyed his bridge." "My resort is flooding," she said, her voice rising. "I have 50 guests trapped upstairs, no power in half the building, and water coming up through the floors. My insurance company is saying it's an act of God, but we both know that's not true." I nodded sympathetically. "Sounds like you should have done more research before you built in a flood zone. Those old-timers knew what they were doing when they put their settlements on higher ground." The look she gave me could have melted steel. "What do you want?" she asked. "Money? I'll pay for a new bridge, better than the old one. Just stop this." I pretended to consider her offer. "Well," I said, "I suppose we could discuss terms, but first, you'd need to publicly acknowledge that you illegally destroyed my family's bridge, apologize to the community for your actions, and maybe explain to your guests why their premium wellness experience turned into a swimming lesson. You're out of your mind, she said. I'm not admitting to anything. That bridge removal was completely legal. I shrugged. Then I guess you'll have to figure out your water problems on your own. Good luck with that. She stormed off, splashing through the puddles that were now forming around her resort's entrance, muttering things that definitely weren't suitable for a wellness retreat brochure. But I wasn't finished yet. The night was young, and the mountains still had more water to share with Marla's premium guests. I made one final adjustment to the dam controls, opening the last reserve channel. If she wanted to play hardball, if she wanted to pretend that destroying my bridge was just business as usual, then she was about to learn that in these mountains, water always bats last. By dawn, Stillness Haven looked like a luxury resort that had been relocated to the bottom of a lake. The main building's first floor was completely flooded, with water lapping at the stairs leading to the second level. The resort's beautiful stone patio, where guests had paid premium prices to practice sunrise yoga, was now underwater. Marla's carefully manicured gardens had become marshland, and her expensive outdoor meditation spaces looked like abstract art installations rising from a shallow pond. The scene was even more dramatic from my elevated position across the lake. What had been a $4 million showcase of contemporary mountain architecture was now something between a houseboat and a very expensive swimming pool. The guests, trapped on the upper floors, had their cell phones pressed against every available window, documenting what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about wellness retreat disaster in Colorado history. Some guests were still trying to maintain their zen while standing knee-deep in muddy water, probably the first time in their lives they'd truly connected with nature, in the most literal sense possible. Marla stood waist-deep in what used to be her reception area, screaming into a waterproof phone at what I assumed was her insurance company. From the gestures she was making, the conversation wasn't going well. Flood insurance, I remembered from my own policy research years ago, specifically excluded natural water flow restoration and seasonal flood patterns. What was happening to her resort wasn't technically a flood in the insurance sense. It was just water returning to where it had always belonged. The emergency response vehicles started arriving around 8 in the morning, but they faced the same problem as everyone else. The access road was now a stream bed. Fire trucks and ambulances parked at the water's edge like they were attending a lakefront emergency, which I suppose they were. The rescue boats looked almost comical, motoring up to the resort's second-floor balconies to evacuate guests who'd paid for premium mountain serenity and instead got an unscheduled white-hotter rafting experience. I watched through my binoculars as each guest was carefully loaded into rescue boats, still wearing their designer yoga outfits but now accessorized with life jackets and emergency blankets. One woman actually waved at the rescue crew like she was enjoying a planned river cruise, probably still convinced this was some kind of immersive wellness experience. The media arrived by noon, having gotten wind of what they were already calling the Great Wellness Flood. News trucks lined the road leading to what used to be the resort's entrance, their crews interviewing evacuated guests and getting aerial footage of the submerged luxury facility. One reporter, standing knee-deep in water that was flowing through Marla's lobby, described it as a stunning example of nature reclaiming what human development had temporarily borrowed. That's when I got the call I'd been expecting. Marla's voice was different now, stripped of all pretense and calculation. "Wade," she said, "I need this to stop, now. The building is structurally compromised, my insurance won't cover any of this, and I've got 50 lawsuits coming from guests who are claiming everything from emotional trauma to pneumonia. What do you want?" "I want my bridge back," I said simply. "The real one, built to the same specifications my grandfather used, with a public apology for destroying the original. I want you to acknowledge that you illegally removed a historic structure without proper consultation with the community, and I want you to pay for all the legal fees I'm going to incur making sure this never happens to anyone else." There was a long silence. "And if I do all that, you'll stop the flooding?" she asked. "I'll consider it," I said. "But first, you need to understand something. This isn't flooding, Marla. This is just water going where it's supposed to go. Your resort was built on a riverbed, and the river is coming home." The final twist came that afternoon, when the county engineer arrived to assess the situation. After examining the site and consulting historical maps, he delivered the news that I'd been waiting for Marla to hear. "Ma'am, this facility was constructed in a natural drainage area. The original environmental assessment should have identified this as unsuitable for permanent structures. I'm afraid you're going to need to demolish and relocate if you want to continue operations." I watched Marla's face through my binoculars as she received this information. Standing in rubber boots in what used to be her luxury resort's lobby, She looked like someone who'd just been told that her winning lottery ticket was actually a fake. The $4 million she'd invested, the dreams of building a wellness empire, the careful planning and legal maneuvering, all of it was literally underwater now. And the best part? Everything I'd done was completely legal. I was just operating historical water management equipment on my own property. That evening, as the sun set over what was now more lake than resort, I made my final decision. I walked back up to the dam one last time and began the process of slowly returning the water to its artificial lake configuration. Not because I felt sorry for Marla, but because I'd made my point. The mountain had spoken, justice had been served, and now it was time to rebuild. The next morning, I called Marla and told her I was willing to restore normal water levels, but my conditions were non-negotiable. She had to make a public apology, admitting that she'd illegally destroyed my bridge and acknowledging the historical significance of what she'd done. She had to pay for a new bridge, built to my specifications, and she had to cover all my legal expenses. Most importantly, she had to do all of this on camera, with local news crews documenting her admission of responsibility. It took her 3 days to agree, 3 days of watching her $4 million investment sitting underwater while insurance adjusters shook their heads and engineers delivered increasingly bad news about structural damage and environmental violations. When she finally called back, her voice was completely different from the confident woman who'd first knocked on my door. "Fine," she said. "I'll do everything you asked. Just please stop this." I could hear the desperation bleeding through her carefully controlled tone, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The press conference was held on a Friday morning, with news crews from Denver and Colorado Springs gathered on the shore of what used to be Pine Lake. Marla stood in front of the cameras wearing a simple business suit instead of her flowing wellness guru outfit, looking like someone who'd aged 5 years and 5 days. She read from a prepared statement, apologizing for the unauthorized removal of a historically significant bridge and admitting that she had acted without proper community consultation or respect for local heritage. Her hands shook slightly as she held the paper, and I noticed she couldn't quite meet the reporter's eyes. As she spoke, I began the slow process of closing the dam gates and returning water to the lake. It was a gradual process, just like the flooding had been, and the cameras captured every moment as the resort slowly emerged from its watery grave. The building was a disaster, of course. Water damage had destroyed the expensive flooring, the carefully chosen furniture, and most of the high-end equipment that had made Stillness Haven a premium destination. The resort was totaled in every sense of the word. Watching it emerge from the water was like watching a shipwreck being raised from the ocean floor, revealing the full extent of the destruction that had been hidden beneath the surface. The insurance settlement, when it finally came through months later, covered maybe 30 cents on the dollar. Flood damage, even when caused by natural water flow restoration, fell into so many exclusion categories that Marla's lawyers couldn't find a legal path to full compensation. The bank foreclosed on the property within 6 months, and the damaged buildings were demolished rather than repaired. The land went up for sale at a fraction of what Marla had originally paid for it. A few weeks later, at the Bitter Hollow Town community meeting, residents unanimously voted to dissolve the Pine Lake HOA for blatant abuse of power causing damage to local heritage. The county sheriff opened an administrative investigation, but everyone knew the real culprit had already been punished by the mountain water in ways that no court of law could have achieved. The dissolution was just paperwork cleaning up what nature had already settled. Old-timers in the community nodded with satisfaction, remembering when neighbors settled disputes with handshakes instead of legal documents. I used the settlement money she paid me to build a new bridge with the same solid concrete construction my grandfather used, but reinforced with modern techniques. The local historical society helped design a plaque explaining the bridge's significance and the story of what had happened when someone tried to erase that history. The bridge became something of a tourist attraction, with people coming from all over Colorado to see the bridge that fought back against an HOA. Some visitors would stand on the bridge for long minutes, running their hands along the railings and asking about the old one that had been destroyed. But the real surprise came 6 months after everything settled down. I started getting emails from people all across the country, folks who'd heard about my story and wanted to know if I could teach them about water management techniques for dealing with difficult neighbors. Apparently, there were a lot of people out there facing similar problems, with HOAs and developers who thought they could bulldoze their way through local communities. The emails came from small towns in Montana, farm families in Nebraska, and even a few folks from suburban neighborhoods, where developers had destroyed old trees or filled in natural drainage areas. I started offering weekend workshops on traditional mountain water systems, teaching people about natural hydrology and water rights law. It turned out that many old properties, especially in the rural West, came with grandfathered water rights that their owners had never fully understood. My little honey business expanded into something much bigger, helping people understand and protect their property rights using the same principles my grandfather had taught me. The workshops filled up months in advance, with people driving hundreds of miles to learn about something their great-grandparents had taken for granted. Doris Rayner, who'd been the one to remind me about the old dam, became something of a local celebrity herself. At 68 years old, she started giving historical tours of the lake area, telling visitors about the old days and explaining how mountain communities had traditionally managed their water resources. She always ended her tours at my bridge, telling the story of how sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to understand the landscape better than they do. Wade didn't fight the system, she'd tell tour groups. He became the system. The site where Stillness Haven used to stand was eventually purchased by the county and turned into a public park. They left the area as natural wetlands, letting the water flow where it wanted to flow, and creating habitat for the wildlife that had been displaced by development. There's a small sign explaining that this area demonstrates natural water flow patterns in mountain ecosystems, though locals know it as the place where a beekeeper taught a wellness guru about the power of paying attention to what came before. As for Marla, she left Colorado entirely and moved back to California, where I heard she tried to start another wellness business. But word travels fast in the wellness community, and the story of Stillness Haven had become something of a cautionary tale. Last I heard, she was working as a yoga instructor at someone else's studio, probably telling her students about the importance of respecting natural energy flows. I hope she learned something from our experience, though I suspect she mostly learned to be more careful about checking water rights before buying property. These days, I wake up each morning and walk across my new bridge to tend my bees just like I always did. The honey tastes the same, the mountains look the same, and the lake flows where it's supposed to flow. Sometimes I get letters from people facing their own HOA battles, asking for advice about dealing with neighbors who think money and lawyers can solve any problem. I always tell them the same thing my grandfather told me. Pay attention to the land, understand what was there before you arrived, and remember that water always finds a way. The best part is that every morning, as I cross that bridge with my jars of honey, I remember that some things are worth fighting for. Heritage, community, and the right to live your life without interference from people who think everything needs to look like a magazine cover. My grandfather built more than just a bridge 60 years ago. He built a lesson about standing your ground, understanding your resources, and never underestimating the power of someone who knows how to listen to the mountain's wisdom. And if anyone else wants to try taking away what my family built, well, I've still got that dam up in the woods, and the water is always ready to have another conversation about respect. And ever since then, folks around Bitter Hollow still tell each other, if you tear down a Thatcher's bridge, you better watch out, because water always remembers the way home.